Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is episode 19 of the KMG show. There is a famous short story from 1886 by Leo Tolstoy. It's called How Much Land Does a Man Need? According to Wikipedia, the protagonist of the story is a peasant named Pahom, who overhears his wife and sister-in-law argue over the merits of town and peasant farm life. He thinks to himself, if I had plenty of land, I shouldn't fear the devil himself. Unbeknownst to him, Satan is present, sitting behind the stove and listening. Satan abruptly accepts his challenge and also tells that he would give Pahom more land and then snatch everything from him. A short time later, a landlady in the village decides to sell her estate, and the peasants of the village buy as much of that land as they can. Pahom himself purchases some land, and by working on the extra land is able to repay his debts and live a more comfortable life. But you see, he wants ever more land. And this is a cautionary tale by Tolstoy. It's a satire of greed and panic, and in the end, panicked greed. I was reminded of this because I suppose the contemporary question today would be, how much toilet paper does a man need? My own country of Canada has not suffered very greatly thus far from coronavirus, and there has been one death, infections reported in 5 provinces, 173 cases, 1 case on Vancouver Island, where I live. Nevertheless, on Twitter yesterday, I was alerted to the fact that people were running mad in Costco and other places, taking all the toilet paper they could get. Now, it has been pointed out, coronavirus is not a disease that is associated with, diarrhea. So why one needs that much toilet paper is an interesting question. But I suppose, everyone else was doing it. Here's a particularly obnoxious recounting of what's going on. It's from the Toronto Star, but it is reported from Vancouver. We're hustlers. Amid coronavirus fears, this couple has made more than $100,000 reselling Lysol wipes. As Manny Ranga and his wife Violeta Perez load up their Ford F50 pickup outside of Costco near downtown Vancouver this week, some passerby couldn't help but stop and stare. What stood out wasn't just the sheer volume of the couple's purchase, it was the fact that it was all the same product, stacks upon stacks of Lysol disinfecting wipes. Is that all for you? One stranger asked. Cleaning company, Perez answered. She was technically correct. They had just cleaned out the store. Manny Ranga and Violeta Perez, I'm going to assume that they are newcomers to my country, because this kind of behavior is very much looked down upon here, but they don't seem guilty or shy about this in the slightest way. The couple say they've made a bundle in the past 3 weeks, hitting up every Costco store in the region each day, buying as many Lysol wipes and liquid cleaners as they can, spending thousands of dollars at a time, and then reselling them mostly on Amazon to private individuals and companies. Amid the growing coronavirus outbreak, the hoarding and reselling of certain household supplies to make a quick buck has become a global phenomenon, contributing to a frenzied panic buying by shoppers who've been fed a steady diet of images of empty store shelves on social media. Ranga, 38, said one 6-pack of wipes that goes for $20 at Costco can catch 4 times that much online. A check of Amazon on Thursday showed that a 6-pack was going for $89 under their seller name Violeta and Sons Trading Limited. Amazon was said to be cracking down on bad actors. There's no place for price gouging on Amazon. Japan has introduced new rules making the reselling of face masks for profit a crime punishable by a 1-year jail term or a hefty fine. Ken Whitehurst of the Consumers Council of Canada says it makes you queasy in the stomach when people exploit an emergency solely for the purpose of making a few extra dollars. Well, to most people, $100,000 is more than a few. Yes. Perez explained their business venture was sparked a few weeks ago when they went to the store to buy supplies, including hand sanitizer. A woman stopped them outside the store and offered to pay them double what they had paid. She said, I find that rather dubious. People normally make a habit of staring into the bags of people coming out of the grocery store. The couple, who described themselves as home developers, immediately saw an opportunity. Yes. So, toilet paper? No, see, toilet paper for these gougers is too big and harder to ship. Archipelago Auto Spa owner Jerry Hugh later confirmed to the Star that he helps Ranga sell some of the cleaning products, but it turns out he's got his own side gig too, selling face masks. I've mentioned before on this stream, it's been a theme of mine for years, that the collapse of community, the collapse of trust leads to a situation where, in a case of an emergency, who can you depend on? And the answer is nobody. But as I say, I am quite taken aback that these three gougers, perfectly happy to be interviewed by a reporter and become infamous in my country. But these are the days of bowling alone. So, who cares about reputation? I suppose I've been thinking a lot about songs, and the like, literature. And I was thinking about the situation in Britain. A Smith song came to mind, Panic on the Streets of London, Panic on the Streets of Birmingham. I wonder to myself, could life ever be sane again? The lead side streets that you slip down, I wonder to myself, hopes may rise on the Grasmere, but honey pie, you're not safe here. There's panic on the streets of Carlisle, Dublin, Dundee, Humberside. Of course, Morrissey wanted to burn down the disco and hang the DJ because the DJ was playing songs that say nothing to me about my life. I was thinking about that with regard to the media. What is it the media reports? The latest from The Bachelor? Oh, celebrity babies, celebrities this, celebrities that, celebrities everything. Is that what people really want to hear about? Is this really relevant to their lives? Or is this manufactured consent? We are going to make you obsessed with celebrities because we can. And what does it mean? It means more consumption. Another song that came to mind was Bob Dylan's Ballad of a Thin Man. You walk into the room with your pencil in your hand, you see someone naked, and you say, "Who is that man?" You try so hard because you just don't understand what you'll say when you get home, because something is happening here, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? You raise up your head and you ask, "Is this where it is?" And someone points to you and says, "It's his." And you say, "What's mine?" And somebody else says, "Where what is?" And you say, "Oh my God, am I here all alone?" Because something is happening here, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? Well, it's definitely true that there is something big going on. Just how big it is remains to be seen. But let's go over the news. Donald Trump, President of the United States, gave a press conference where he declared a national emergency over coronavirus. I had thought that there was already an emergency that had been declared. But in any event, the declaration frees up as much as $50 billion in financial resources to assist Americans affected by the outbreak. And he had a lot of CEOs there with him. And people have complained that Trump has spoken too much about the stock market because 80% of trades in the equity markets now are by bots, done by algorithms. So Dave Pinson, our friend, said, watching the press conference on delay on Bloomberg TV, smart move of Trump to bring up the CEOs of the big retailers to let you know they're going to stay open and we're not going to have to revert to hunting and gathering just yet. I decided to go down to my local branch of Save On Foods at 7:30 this morning. Save On Foods is the dominant superstore chain in British Columbia. It's owned by the Canadian billionaire Jim Pattison. And I thought, okay, toilet paper, paper towel, is all that going to be gone? No, it wasn't. But it's clear that an enormous amount of this paper has been moved onto the shelves, and there were sales for all of these things. So at least where I live, there is no TP shortage yet. Perhaps there will be a shortage of dark chocolate because people are quite taken with the rumor that eating dark chocolate will somehow prevent one from getting coronavirus. I don't know the reason for that or whether there's any possible truth to it, but I suppose if it makes people feel better, then there's no harm in it. Let's see, from NBC News, Trump condemns CDC for lack of coronavirus testing, blames Obama. It's always risky, when you're 3 years into your presidency and you blame the previous guy, the last guy, for problems in your administration. But this is a problem that I suppose Trump has walked into. It was obvious to every intelligent person that it was going to take a long time to drain the swamp. There has been very little testing done in the United States, fewer than 100, something like that, which sounds astounding. But somehow the NBA all got tested. Matthew Broderick's sister got tested. Let's see. As far as I understand, the World Health Organization had protocols for tests, and the Centers for the Disease Control thought that these tests were no good, and they had to come up with their own tests, and there have been numerous problems with this, false positives, lack of reagents, and the like. Trump tweeted, for decades, the CDC looked at and studied its testing system, but did nothing about it. It would always be inadequate and slow for a large-scale pandemic, but a pandemic would never happen, they hoped. President Obama made changes that only complicated things further. He followed up, their response to H1N1 swine flu was a full-scale disaster with thousands dying and nothing meaningful done to fix the testing problem until now. The changes have been made and testing will soon happen on a very large-scale basis. All red tape has been cut, ready to go. On Thursday, Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, testified at a House hearing that the U.S. has failed to meet the capacity for testing. The system is not really geared to what we need right now. He said, that is a failing. Let's admit it. Well, I think that Trump has a point because Trump has been assailed repeatedly for sticking his head in where it doesn't belong. Oh, what does he know about the intelligence community? So he should leave it to the experts. Well, the CDC is made up of experts, and it turns out that quite a few weeks into an epidemic, they don't have testing ready, which seems a very serious condemnation of the CDC. Trump announced today that there is going to be drive-through testing. Apparently, there were 4-hour waits in Denver for this today. I saw some amusing tweets regarding the situation in Canada. In Ottawa, I think, where I think the whole business was scrubbed. There were 4-hour lines, cars snaking for miles. But the tweets gave the impression that if you went to the drive-through, you could get coronavirus. I suppose it was just awkwardness with English. But this is the state that we are in. So I mentioned there doesn't seem to be much damage yet from coronavirus in Canada, but of course, the Prime Minister's wife, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, has tested positive for the coronavirus. She is in isolation, as is her husband, Justin, the Prime Minister. The wife of the Prime Minister apparently was infected while in the United Kingdom, where she had a speaking engagement. You see this term speaking engagement constantly. It's never specified exactly what the speaking engagement was, which makes me rather suspicious. I didn't really know that the Prime Minister's wife was jetting around the world, lecturing people on God knows what, apart from being married to Justin Trudeau. She was the Quebec correspondent of E-Talk for 5 years. And you know the shows. It's like Entertainment Tonight. The correspondent's job is to basically go up to celebrities and say, how did you get so awesome? Sophie Gregoire has suffered from mental problems in the past. She suffered from bulimia very seriously when she was a younger woman. She's apparently not comfortable with fame, and yet, so why is she flying off to Britain to make speeches? So the federal government is warning, that's the Canadian federal government, against all international travel and is limiting inbound flights. There's still no banning going on. Trudeau said earlier that would be a knee-jerk reaction, racism, stigma. We are looking to reduce the number of airports that will accept travelers from overseas in order to be able to give the proper resources on all arrivals to ensure we're doing everything we can to keep Canadians and Canada safe. We're also obviously looking at countries of origin and further measures we can take. We will make those decisions based on the best science, the best recommendations of our health officials. And there is a picture, of Dr. Theresa Tam, who is, I never failed to point out, Chinese and born in China. She spoke out several weeks ago saying, of course, that the number one problem, was stigma and racism. So I'm a little suspicious about her contribution. So apparently Trudeau is still looking at banning flights from certain countries. How about Italy? Italy, that would seem to be at the top of the list. But no. The next thing I'm going to tell you, well, it comes from a website called Crazy Days and Nights, which is a very popular gossip site. So here goes. Don't tell anyone, even with the words I am writing, this might be the shortest big blind ever. This foreign-born A-plus list politician, all of you know, and some might have a thing for, has been living separately from his wife for at least the past 4 months. And there is a reference there to something which came up during the last Canadian election, which we were told was misinformation, grossly irresponsible misinformation, having to do with a certain NDA supposedly signed by the Prime Minister, which deals with things that happened some years ago when he was a school teacher. So the Conservative opposition is attacking the Liberals over the coronavirus response, lack of border crackdowns. It's a difficult path to take. You don't want to be like Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden appearing to be disloyal at a time of national emergency. But the story from Global says, in question period, though, the issue of border controls dominated questions from Conservative MPs who demanded to know why the government wasn't increasing screening at entry points. or restricting travel from hotspot countries, given most cases in Canada are linked to travel from abroad. When the final flight out of Italy landed here, passengers were not screened, no temperatures were taken, and no one was quarantined. They were given a pamphlet and sent on their way, said opposition leader Andrew Scheer. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland said that Canadians are living in an anxious time, but suggested the federal government isn't planning any similar measures. We need to continue to listen to our medical experts. They are telling us that the situation will get worse before it gets better. They also say that Canada is well prepared. Our government will do whatever it takes to keep Canadians healthy and safe, unless, of course, that means, cutting off travel from foreign countries, because again, that would be stigmatizing. Avoid global travel, Trudeau says. Financial help coming. Coronavirus is going to hit the United States hard, but it's going to hit Canada much, much harder because of course, the United States has the petrodollar. Canada does not. Canada can only sell things abroad because we keep the value of the Canadian dollar so low. The American dollar trades at, or Canadian dollar trades at about a 33% discount to the US dollar. Oil revenues, gas revenues are just been smacked in recent years, and now they're going to fall even more. The country was in a panic previously over blockades by Native Indians and their allies, which had a significant economic effect. This is all terrible news for Canada and Justin Trudeau. Markets had a good day. The Dow was up almost 2,000 points, over 9%. The S&P 500 and NASDAQ also up over 9%. The VIX, or the Scaredy Cat index, was down more than 23%. And what is Jim Cramer saying? That you just got to buy? You got to buy this dip? This is all new, or it's all relatively new. Not that long ago, the only place that you saw reference to the Dow, unless there was some spectacular collapse, you go to the financial pages. And I suppose most people didn't know what the Dow or the S&P 500 were. And similarly, most people did not know what the GDP was. But these are now the indexes for our financial health. They have very little to do with the financial health of most people. But this is another example, it strikes me, of manufactured consent. Oh, also in British Columbia, was it self-isolation? That's what everyone's talking about. And I live on an island, and that island is connected to the mainland by ferries. There are some small plane flights, but most people travel back and forth from the island by ferries. And a mayor of one of Victoria's suburbs wanted people to be able to stay in their cars on the ferries. The cars are on the lowest levels, and then people get out of their cars. This is mandatory, and they go up to the upper levels. And the reason for that, obviously, is because in the event of an accident, well, if they're down in the lower levels there's going to be panic and fights to try to get to the upper levels in the lifeboats, and that would not be good. And the federal government has refused to allow people to stay in their cars and ferry rides. But I suppose the big question one of the big questions that people are asking about the Wu flu, the China virus, the coronavirus, is how will this affect my deviant sexual practices? From San Francisco, the Bay Area Reporter, coronavirus outbreak postpones hearing on San Francisco bathhouse policy. A Thursday hearing to discuss a policy change to allow bathhouses like Steamworks in Berkeley in San Francisco has been canceled due to the coronavirus outbreak. The first hearing on allowing gay bathhouses to reopen in San Francisco has been postponed in the light of the coronavirus outbreak. Gay District 8 Supervisor Raphael Mandelbaum made the decision to postpone the planned hearing for Thursday, March 12th, on his ordinance aimed at updating the city's policies regarding private rooms in adult sex venues. So far, the Bay Area's two gay bathhouses, the Water Garden in San Jose and Steamworks in Berkeley, remain open and have not shut down due to the coronavirus. San Francisco's bathhouse restrictions were instituted in 1984 during the height of the AIDS epidemic in response to a lawsuit the city had filed. Now, there was a considerable reluctance to shut down bathhouses, which were one of the main incubators of the AIDS epidemic because, of course, stigma and homophobia, how such places are allowed to exist. Well, it really is remarkable. I mentioned dark chocolate. I like dark chocolate. Up to 70%. Higher than 70%. Too bitter for me. But Missouri sues Jim Baker for selling his fake coronavirus cure silver solutions after the Food and Drug Administration sent the controversial televangelist a cease and desist letter. The show was selling a bundle of silver solution products for more than $125. To use, consumers were instructed to apply generously to skin as needed to help promote natural healing. There's a joke, a meme in Canada that Trudeau announces that he is putting a black paste on his skin to prevent him from getting coronavirus, and that aides are constantly having to run up to him saying, "No, Mr. Prime Minister," because, of course, our Prime Minister is very fond of blackface. Let's see. Slate asks the big question, should I pause my open marriage because of the coronavirus? My mother is immunocompromised. Is it unreasonable to ask my husband not to swap fluids with his girlfriend until the coronavirus blows over? What a time we live in. Slate responds, given China's apparent success in slowing the virus by isolation measures that some might call draconian, there's an argument to be made for social distancing to help contain a potential pandemic. So far, I've yet to see a public health official weigh in on limiting one's exposure to his girlfriend. To be safe, you could ask your husband to do so. Also, to be safe, make sure none of you leave the house for any reason whatsoever. Wear gas masks constantly, even in the shower, even to bed, and apply hand sanitizer so often that your skin is never not gleaming with an alcoholic dew. Oh, this is sarcasm, I gather. Or you could just live your life and follow basic public health advisories. If your mother lives with you or you are otherwise regularly in her proximity, she certainly does require special considerations here. Everyone's got enough drama to deal with as it is. Well, it seems to me that if you're married and that your husband has a girlfriend and you have a boyfriend and you are willingly seeking out extra drama, more questions. What is the etiquette for when girls are in a bar and one of them sees some hot guy but then her girlfriend decides to snag the hot guy? Are there dibs on hot guys? I remember when Slate started, about 1995? Michael Kinsley was the first editor, and it was really quite good. It's rubbish tier now. And some more worries. The excellent Christian satire site, the Babylon Bee, that seems like an oxymoron, but it's better than The Onion. Parents worry they'll have to raise their own children as government schools shut down. Schools, they're not supposed to be warehouses. They're not supposed to provide free babysitting, but that's essentially what they do. You see, we have to have, after school programs, and lay on stuff during the summer, because the primary purpose of schools now is to get children out of their home so their mothers can work full time. Interesting experiment going on there. Babylon Bee also reports nation's nerds wake up in utopia where everyone stays inside, sports are canceled, and social interaction is forbidden. That is pretty good. Let's see. Let's look at the chat. We have a lot of chat. I should have a moderator here today. Yes, I do. How about that? So there was some spamming going on. I'm waiting for the Andrew Gillum takes by KMG. Don't worry. They're coming. Jaakko Raipala says, all stores in Finland were out of toilet paper today. That is very sad. I would have thought that the Finns were more sensible than that. Somebody told me that they saw hand sanitizer for $400 plus, for something that's $400 plus on eBay. I'm told that you can make your own. You need pure alcohol, 3 parts to 1 part glycerin or glycol. I don't know whether anyone would find that tip useful, but there you go. And our Finnish contributor says it's funny how the TP hoarding madness is global too now, and it travels even faster than the disease. Well, I suppose this is a result of social media. You know, when Marshall McLuhan's writing in the 1960s about media, it was nowhere near as pervasive as it is now. If there are runs on toilet paper anywhere in the world, we can expect to see this in real time or almost real time on Twitter. So, you know, a panic in Helsinki becomes a panic everywhere. There were guys in the drugstore today all talking to their wives on the phone about the lack of TP, LOL. I'm always curious about these conversations, you know, of men in the grocery store or the drugstore or whatever, and they're talking to their wives on the cell phone or their girlfriends, and, you know, the sort of stuff that goes on. You know, the husband calls up the wife and says, okay, the list says cat food. What kind of cat food? And then you know that she's saying, are you telling me you don't know? Well, yes, I know. Do you pay attention to anything, she says? Fancy feast? No, it's not fancy feast. And then, liver? No. Are cats allergic to liver? How could you not know that? And it's just embarrassing. It's just so embarrassing. It's like, okay, here I am out in public, but I have the need to call up and get nagged at. Chadson says, all ammo is sold out where I live. And of course, this is a problem with hoarding that is well known, especially when, you know, the hoarders, the preppers, boast about how well prepared they are. Like Vox Day has been boasting that, yeah, how are you going to protect your stuff when people, angry people threatening to use violence, decide that it's time for you to share? Some people are making a lot of money out of this. Yeah, I suppose they are. I mean, there was that couple from Vancouver we talked about at the top of the show who apparently had made $100 grand. But of course, I suspect that we're going to see a lot of greater fools here. People who are going to find themselves, you know, with 500 rolls or 1,000 rolls of toilet paper. And yeah, there's going to be people with a whole bunch of stuff that they're not going to be able to sell. John Miller says, my local grocery stores are a shit show. Costco is even a bigger shit show. I've never been to a Costco. Isn't that the place where you go and you get, you know, 12 jars of dipping sauce, you know, and it's all wrapped up? Enormous amounts of things. Okay. John Miller says, if you get overrun by the gift. The world is screwed out of latex. Okay. Loblaws. Okay, hang on just a second. Can you spare a square? Yeah, I figured that's a Seinfeld reference. I thought that someone was going to make that reference. I must say that I'm pleased about that. Trump shaking hands was hilarious, says Matt Young. We know that the president is a germophobe. He was photographed shaking the hands of President Bolsonaro of Brazil, who we were told tested positive for coronavirus, and then we were told he did not test positive. I don't know. I just, I don't think that it would be very good for confidence if the leader of one's country tested positive for coronavirus. Now, so Justin Trudeau's wife has coronavirus. One would assume, if they were together, then he would get it too. John Miller says, let's keep Trudeau's wife's boyfriend in our hearts. He must be devastated. How are you guys doing on supplies? I'm not really prone to panic. But then, of course, if you find yourself in a situation where you have to move now, or it's all gone, I suppose the tendency is, at least for me, to move now, which is part of the problem. Virginia Meadows Respecter says, can you recommend any other gossip sites? Strange thing, so many of them seem to be formatted like websites circa 2000. I use the alt AGC gossip site. It's an aggregator. It's mostly CDAN stuff, but it has stuff from other sites. And I gather it comes from a group that was originally called Alt Gossip Celebrities. But that's as much as I need to have. The advantage of the aggregator is that if people are guessing about the blind items, and there seems to be a consensus that the blind item is about this person or that group of people, the answers are included on the aggregator site such that it's not necessary to keep going back to the original, especially since so many of the comments are deliberately ridiculous or facetious. Mirage says, seems to me the market will go still lower if lockdown policies are to be put in place in the U.S. like we see in Italy and China. Well, yeah, I mean, Italy, as I mentioned previously, this has the potential to wreck the European Union in quite short order. You just get all the dominoes falling at once. Italy was already part of a somewhat infamous group called the Pigs, as they call them. PIIGS, that would be Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. These are countries that are in terrible financial shape, and of course, Italy is going to be absolutely devastated by this. Gerald Perry likes dark chocolate. Okay. Something about PayPal? My PayPal, I had trouble with my PayPal account. It was restricted and blocked for several months, but after giving them all of the information short of a DNA sample, it now works perfectly well at Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Polygon says, Talib is right, better to panic early rather than later. Yeah, I suppose that's true, but the difficulty is that this is a new kind of panic that we're dealing with. This is a new social media panic, and we don't really know what the results of that are going to be. Given how much anxiety there is, especially amongst women because of social media, it seems to me there's a serious possibility that if the panic level gets much higher, the anxiety level gets much higher, we're going to start seeing a rash of suicides. And A dead body is a dead body, whether, regardless of the cause. John Miller says the EU is so screwed they are in desperate need for a fiscal policy, but have fun dealing with like 20 fiscal houses. Monetary policy can only get you so far. Well, yeah. The EU can't work as an economic unit because of how disparate the economies are. I mean, it's absurd. And again, how long will the people of Germany be content to pay for the pigs and other countries that are not shaping up? Okay, so let's go back to talking about, well, Jim Kunstler. Had enough excitement yet? He writes, at least the stock markets are following an established script. The bubble pops, the elevator drops. For a while, it stops, and then investments sink to the deepest subbasement where they linger for a long, long time. Hello, next Great Depression. We know how that story goes, even if it hurts. The coronavirus is something else. Whatever it is, he says, I'm not persuaded that it's a hoax. One monster banging around in that fog is the narrative that China started this thing simply to get rid of Trump. There's a real baby in bathwater proposition. Would China, in effect, blow up its export economy for that, i.e. commit suicide? Because a lot of those prior arrangements will probably not come back. The manufacturing supply lines for this and that, the fabulous cornucopia of plastic goodies extruded from all those smoking factories and flushed out to the world, the whole glorious let's get rich extravaganza that Deng Xiaoping kicked off 40 years ago. It's looking like the global economy is on the rocks, perhaps for good, as we knew it. Is China as plumb crazy as, for instance, America's political left? Hey, people are talking about things that are going to disappear because coronavirus and things that won't be missed. How about Pinyin? I'm going to vote for Pinyin. That, okay, so apparently the way that we've been saying Chinese words, Chinese names is wrong. Well, of course, they're all transliterated. Before I was born, the capital of China was called Peiping or Peiping. Then it became Peking. Then it became Beijing. Why is this necessary? We have our own names for foreign cities. India decides, oh, you have to call Bombay Mumbai. No, we don't. We don't call Prague Praha. We don't call Munich München. We don't call Cologne Köln. I could go on. We don't call the capital of Russia Moskva. But how is it useful to have, okay, it D-E-N-G, but it's pronounced dung. How is that possibly useful? Why the use of X's? Why not Z's instead? I just get the impression that people do this because they can, to be nuisances. Oh, you thought you knew all this stuff? Well, you don't know anything anymore. Get used to the new thing, which we're going to force you to learn. And then after you've learned it, we'll change it again. Kunstler continues, if anything, China has only validated Trump's point that America bargained away its industrial independence and must become more self-sufficient again. True enough. Where I depart from MAGA is my sense that the industrial age itself has probably shot its wad, and that whatever America makes of itself going forward is likely to be a much more modest and simpler way of life without a lot of the dazzling bells and whistles we've become accustomed to, and perhaps some genuine hardship. Yeah, I wonder how much of this is really necessary, in the sense that a generation ago, if you wanted something, wanted to buy something, you say go to a department store or a specialty store. I used to spend a lot of time in record stores, a lot of times. There aren't any record stores anymore to speak of. And stores that had a large record section, they've got a tiny one or not one at all. You've seen a similar thing with DVDs and Blu-rays. So you order them from Amazon or another vendor. So you got to get involved in that whole supply chain. Was it really so bad when people had to, go to a store to buy things. I mean, there is a real pleasure to be had from going from, I want this, I will go to the place where it is, I will pay for it and take it home, and there it is. I I mentioned a parcel that I had delivered by UPS, which arrived a day and a half late, after 7 o'clock, when it's not supposed to arrive. I'm told that UPS is suffering driver shortages. I asked the fellow, very friendly fellow, who delivered the stuff about 7:15. I'd spent most of 2 days just hanging around waiting for it. You're suffering shortages? And he said, always. Well, I wonder if, drivers aren't coming in because of fear of infection. Kunstler continues, I say that, readers will recall, because it really comes down to the energy inputs available, and that part of the picture has gone pretty grim in just the past week. The convergence of world events has driven a wooden stake through the heart of the shale oil business. From the get-go, shale oil was a loser because it just cost too much to get that oil out of the rock it was trapped in. It only worked as a financial stunt during the low-interest lending orgy of the last decade. It was a magnificent stunt, you understand, goosing U.S. production to 13 million barrels a day, energy independence, with all those short-term feel-good vibes. But it was just a stunt, and now it's over. The reality of this has yet to penetrate the American hive mind. If you want something, if you want to produce a lot of something, well, that can be done. It's just a question of how much it is going to cost. There's no such thing as energy independence, regardless of 13 million barrels a day, when the companies are losing money hand over fist and the lenders become extremely vulnerable to bankruptcy as a result. In any event, coronavirus neatly imploded that financing scaffold, and now, with world business lockdown and markets cratering, capital is vanishing. As I've averred before, the shale companies spent 10 years proving to investors they can't make a red cent. Their bonds and notes are sinking into sub-investment grade oblivion. Some of the major producers, Whiting, Oasis, Chesapeake, have lost over 90% of their share value and will probably soon be gone. Who would lend them more money now, even if the money was there? Maybe Uncle Sam's wicked stepson, Trump, if it comes to that. That is a possibility. Meanwhile, oil is cheap, but demand is gone. Planes are not flying, ships are not sailing, stadiums are empty, lots of things are shutting down, and quite a bit of it may not ever come back. Yes. And what have the Democrats got for this? Because apparently this is all Trump's fault. U.S. politics were already crazy enough before all this suddenly happened. The crisis of the past few weeks also saw the supernatural elevation of Joe Biden to the utterly implausible role of last vehicle standing in the Democratic Party demolition derby. Who do they think they were kidding? Not only is Joe Biden observably gone in the head, that is clearly unfit to be president, but he's loaded down with a steaming, fetid cargo of easily proven grifting offenses so clunky and obvious they would embarrass a South Philly mobster. I'm sure Biden stayed in the race solely to avoid investigation for his operations in Ukraine and China with son Hunter. So, one of the problems with the great, global warming, aka climate change, aka climate emergency, aka Extinction Rebellion crisis, that it moves like that story that a lot of you had to read in school, Lenigan versus the ants. Ants don't move very fast. And okay, so it's been what now, more than 30 years since we were told we're missing the crisis. And when is Earth going to turn into Venus? When are they going to get to the fireworks factory? Notice you don't hear a lot of people talking about climate change these days. How about that? But is it a hoax? Is coronavirus a hoax? Is the panic necessary? I see the Z-Man seems to believe it is. And he is not very happy with Gregory Cochrane and Steve Saylor. He writes, I trust the plague more than our rulers. That really is the main issue at the moment. In good times, you can have idiots and Gerts. I don't know what a Gert is. In positions of authority. The last time we had a serious crisis, there were serious men in government who knew what to do. Whatever you may think about the massive bailout of the banks during the mortgage crisis, it prevented a collapse, or alternatively, pushed that down 10 years down the road so that the collapse would be even greater. This time, I fear we don't have serious men in the room. We may be about to learn why it is a bad idea to stock government with entertaining nitwits. Okay, that's what he had to say today. And yesterday, we are getting a glimpse now of what the great baby boomer retirement is going to look like in the coming decade if we execute all of the people who like debating the precise dates of generational divisions. We can agree that the cohort in question is roughly those who came of age in the late 60s and the late 70s, two waves of post-war baby boom. Right now, the number of elderly people grows by an average of 2.8% annually. It will peak at about 80 million. Notice that Bernie Sanders promising free health care got no senior support. The reason is seniors have Medicare. Blacks have Medicaid. Yes, and that's another meme that's going around, is that the reason that Black Americans were not attracted to Bernie Sanders' campaign is that Bernie Sanders was promising free medical care and free schooling, and their response was, we got that already. Z-Man continues, this brings us back to the Chinese flu. Otherwise, sensible people like Greg Cochrane and Steve Saylor are clanging the bell, trying to get people to declare a war on the COVID-19 virus. What they're suggesting, short of some sort of miracle cure or vaccine, would require rearranging American society. It would need rounds of universal testing, mass quarantines, and testing of every human crossing the border. North America would have to become something like North Korea in terms of travel restrictions. Keep in mind that polio is still around despite generations of eradication efforts. We have vaccines for a lot of nasty viruses. We have no vaccine for the Chinese flu, and no one is sure when we can get one. In other words, eradicating this virus without vaccine will require a massive reorganization of society. What we're seeing is the first glimpse of what democracy looks like when 20% of the population is elderly. Baby boomers have always voted for stuff they want, and soon they want to be insulated from the dangers of old age. If it requires us to turn America into a hermit kingdom in order to prevent a boomer pox from getting loose, then that's the price the younger generation must pay. The salient political issue of this decade will be how to best guard the old coots from the grim reaper. And I see that the younger people are getting quite antsy about this. I mentioned the suggestions that we've been hearing that the coronavirus will be useful. The great replacement is not happening fast enough, so we have to start killing all the boomers. And so today, or I guess it was yesterday, we found out that hashtag boomer consumer was trending. That is to say, that the COVID-19 flu killing all the boomers, and isn't that great? Well, I suppose it depends on what side of the generational divide one is on, or what one thinks about mass murder, or at least wishing for the death of millions of people. But there was a furious reaction from boomers to this hashtag. And as people have pointed out, well, if you're going to continually attack millennials as being snowflakes and the like, well, get used to some insults directed at you. That's how it works. But you can't criticize us. We're the greatest generation. We invented music, etc., etc. And peace, love, and dope, and all that great stuff. There's a woman called Tasha Karidan. I suppose you could call her a conservative. She's in the Canadian media. She's not even a boomer. Okay. She's Gen X. But her response was, for all the evil people calling COVID-19 the boomer remover, I hope your parents leave their money to the local animal shelter. And my response was, your response is peak boomer and you're not even a boomer. Kudos. Yeah. Yeah. You ungrateful brats. You ungrateful bastards. Well, I'll fix your wagon. Yeah. I'm going to take all my money and I'm going to give it to the SPCA. Ha 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 ha. Yeah. Yeah. You're going to be unhappy about all the lack of respect that you refused to show me. Let's see. Z-Man writes, there's another angle to this. The source of collective action proposed by people like Steve Saylor and Greg Cochran could only happen in a cohesive, high-trust country with lots of social capital. The source of communities where people like Cochran and Saylor grew up had those qualities. Modern America, in contrast, is a multicultural amalgamation of low-trust clusters. The store of social capital has been burned up a long time ago in order to have cheap stuff. If you dispute this, look at the comment section of Breitbart or Conservative Treehouse. For those people, it's always 1985. What happens when they find out that that ain't happening? Will it make any difference if the oldsters finally see their interests are threatened by the great brown wave that is washing over America? We'll soon find out. This panic, and that is what we are seeing, will change things far more than the virus. We're about to learn just how much social capital is left, and the answer is probably not going to be encouraging. Well, I suppose that, what we've seen initially is get your hands off that toilet paper. That's my toilet paper. And I hate old people, and I hope they all die. It's true. It's not encouraging. Steve Saylor asked the question, do people who wear contact lenses own glasses? Maybe they should, wear the glasses instead, because then they wouldn't be touching their eyes. So yes, he says a lot of people who wear contact lenses also own eyeglasses. Should they switch back to wearing glasses for the duration, less touching their eyes, more covering of their eyes? I do wear contact lenses. I've worn contact lenses for decades. I wear the kind which are called monthlies, which are, you don't have to take them out every day and put them in every day. So that's not a problem for me. I don't know that there's very many people around anymore who still wear the kind of contact lenses that you have to take in and out on a regular basis. As far as more covering the eyes go, contact lenses provide far more covering than glasses. The contact lenses are a kind of a permeable protective shield for the eyes. And I've noticed at times when I take my contact lenses out, which is quite rare, that my eyes become far more sensitive to smoke and grit and that sort of thing. But apparently we're at the level now of worrying about contact lenses. Vox Day. Geez, I don't know. I don't know about this guy. He talked about the boomer cost, and then he excised that from his column. He writes today, conspiracy theorists are well aware that the COVID-19 virus wasn't made in China. Dun, dun, dun. And it would be very interesting to see how well the globalists are able to maintain their ever-shifting narratives if the Chinese government, which knows perfectly well how fake those narratives are, decides to systematically demolish them. Because worldwide pandemics starting because someone ate a bat, no ate a pangolin, are so much more convincing than bio-warfare. Well, I'd like to remind Vox Day that communists don't think like other people, because everything is explained by ideology, as Kotkin calls it, Bolshevik speak. So that the idea that the people who run the Chinese Communist Party, are disinterested and they are under the command of the great God reason is absolutely preposterous. So what's he going to tell us next? A lot of black people in the United States believe that the AIDS virus, or HIV, was developed deliberately at Fort Meade, Maryland, in order to kill black people. They believe all sorts of things like that. What Kentucky Fried Chicken, Church's Fried Chicken, various drinks apparently cause sterility. What else could change? Young Americans say billionaires do more harm than good, study shows from the Washington Post. Billionaires have taken a kicking in the last couple of weeks, but I suppose that Mike Bloomberg started with $60 billion. He blew anywhere up to $1 billion on his presidential campaign, and then he took a kicking. Poor Mike Bloomberg might be reduced to, I don't know, $45 billion. I hope he can somehow get by. I wonder how many of these people are going to flee to New Zealand or have already planned fleeing to New Zealand. I am not a Bolshevik, but people ending up with $60 billion or more, someone like Jeff Bezos, I don't really understand how this is thought to be a good thing. I mean, it really is a turn to the so-called Gilded Age, but people like Rockefeller and Carnegie actually contributed mightily in a way that people like Mike Bloomberg and Jeff Bezos have not. So here's a fellow from MIT. He says that fear-mongering on coronavirus will go down as biggest fraud to manipulate economies. This is from a site called techstartups.com. Yesterday, the WHO declared COVID-19 a global epidemic. It's claimed over 4,000 lives with 100,000 infected cases reported worldwide. Dr. Shiva Ayadurai, an MIT scientist and researcher on the human immune system, is one of the most respected experts who thinks that the media and deep state are doing the world a disservice by exaggerating the impact of the virus. He said it's time to stop scaring people and start talking about immune health. Dr. Shiva might be right. Back in October 2009, H1N1 killed 1,000 people in the United States, including almost 100 children, before President Obama later declared national emergency. At the time, the media hysteria was not as high as it is today. Earlier today, we also published a story using data from the CDC and WHO that tells a different story than what the media has been saying. As an MIT PhD in biological engineering who studies and does research nearly every day on the immune system, the coronavirus fear-mongering by the deep state will go down in history as one of the biggest frauds to manipulate economies, suppress dissent, and push mandated medicine. As expected, his tweet sparks controversy, with some saying COVID-19 has higher fatality rate than the seasonal flu, and also pointing out the daily increase in the number of infection cases. I don't know how anyone can say this with any certainty, because, well, when you look at the United States or Canada, give two examples. How much testing is there being done? And again, a question I raised last week, how many of these people who are dying would have likely died of something else over the same time frame, such as influenza? The Chinese government, wow, they are really going all in on this. A spokesman for China's foreign ministry suggested on Thursday the U.S. military may have brought the coronavirus to the Chinese city of Wuhan, which has been hardest hit by the outbreak. China has taken great offense at comments by U.S. officials accusing it of being slow to react to the virus first detected in Wuhan late last year and of not being transparent enough. On Wednesday, U.S. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien said the speed of China's reaction to the emergence of the coronavirus had probably cost the world 2 months when it could have been preparing for the outbreak. In a strongly worded tweet written in English on his verified Twitter account, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian said it was the United States that lacked transparency. Zhao, an avid and often combative Twitter user, did not offer any evidence for a suggestion that the U.S. military might be to blame for the outbreak in China. Well, I've read a lot about communists, and they're just like progressives. They project. They never stop projecting. When a communist accuses someone or something of anything, they're doing it. Almost certainly, they are doing it. A site called Global Research, Center for Research on Globalization, which I found useful in the past, well, they have bought into this as well. That apparently the evil United States came up with this and somehow managed to get it to break out, a few hundred yards from a Chinese bio facility? Wow, that is really remarkable if that were the case. I suppose China is very upset because it came from China. It is the Chinese flu. And look at Italy. Italy decided that, yeah, we don't want Italians working in, say, the fashion industry anymore, the leather industry. So we're going to allow 100,000 Chinese to come in, mostly from Wuhan. And of course, we'll let them fly back and forth on their holidays. And of course, Italy's completely shut down now. Tucker Carlson was very strong on this last night. And he first addressed immigration, saying it is not a boutique issue. The question who lives in your country is the most basic issue that any nation faces ever. When coronavirus began to spread globally, sane countries started to secure their borders. They wanted to know exactly who was coming in and out, and they wanted to control it. He said of China, ask yourself, who can make you beg for mercy? If one of your kids had a bad infection, you would do anything for antibiotics. But our leaders don't control those drugs. China does. The Chinese manufacture our entire supply of antibiotics, not to mention countless other goods your family literally could not live without. And here's the worst news. The Chinese hate us and threaten to withhold life-saving medicine from us. Our most powerful enemy in the world is the power of life and death over our country. We should not let a single day pass before fixing this. I was told some years ago, and apparently this is true, that when you buy sausages, any kind of sausages, they come in a casing. Well, all those cases come from China, every single one of them. How did this happen? Why do our antibiotics come from China? Why does China have a monopoly over metals such as rare earths? Well, you could ask Dianne Feinstein about that one, because the senator, who's a very rich woman, her husband was involved in that deal. That China is a far worse place than the Soviet Union was, say, after the death of Stalin. In fact, in terms of control of its population, it has reached a level that I suppose Stalin could only have dreamed of. The Chinese steal our economic secrets. They send people to our countries to spy on us. As far as the Uyghurs go, the Chinese have decided to do something that I'm not really aware has ever happened in history before. They're killing the men and they're forcing the women to marry Han Chinese. That is to say, they're attempting to breed the Uyghurs out of existence. Very ambitious of them. And yet, how many people rail about China? Oh, yes, and there was their one-child policy, which, of course, has backfired on them in a very big way. But apparently it's Russia that is the big threat. Apparently it's Russia that's a terrible, bad country. Do you know that bad things happen to journalists in Russia? Yeah, there is no free press. None, not even close. In China. Zero. And yet, for some reason, the elite loves China and hates Russia. Well, I guess because they make money off China. That would be the reason why. And as far as the hatred of Russia goes, there's a long-standing ethnic animus, which I don't think that I need to explain. So, Pat Buchanan writes, will the coronavirus kill the New World Order? Well, here's hoping. Of course, Pat Buchanan has been railing against the New World Order since, well, before it actually coalesced. And he told us what the results were going to be, and we didn't listen to him. And we decided that he was a bad man who, as much as possible, had to be deplatformed. He writes, it may one day be said that the coronavirus delivered the death blow to the New World Order, to a half century of globalization, and to the era of interdependence of the world's great nations. Tourism, air travel, vacation cruises, international gatherings, and festivals are already shutting down. Travel bans between countries and continents are being imposed. Conventions, concerts, and sporting events are being canceled. Will the Tokyo Olympics go forward? I hope not. I hope not. It's a grotesque spectacle, really. And it does not, it causes enmity between people. That's all that it does. We all pretend to be interested in sports that no one is interested, simply so that our guys can beat their guys. And it's enabled this strange situation where you have so-called amateur athletes who are still competing as amateurs well into their 30s and sometimes into their 40s. This is their profession. Was not the original purpose of the Olympic Games. Buchanan continues, as for the open borders crowd, do Democrats still believe that breaking into our country should no longer be a crime and immigrants arriving illegally should be given free health care? A proposition to which all the Democratic debaters raised their hands. The ideological roots of our free trade era can be traced to the mid-19th century, when its great evangelist, Richard Cobden, rose at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester in 1946 and rhapsodized, I see in the free trade principle that which shall act on the moral world as the principle of gravitation in the universe, drawing men together, thrusting aside the antagonism of race and creed and language, and uniting us in the bonds of eternal peace. Globaloney, as Claire Booth Luce memorably dubbed it, as far back as the 1940s. And that's why they call free traders, laissez-faire capitalists, Manchester liberals, after Richard Cobden. In retrospect, was it wise to have relied on China to produce essential parts for the supply chain of goods vital to our national security? Does it appear wise to have moved the production of pharmaceuticals and life-saving drugs for heart disease, strokes, and diabetes to China? Does it appear wise to have allowed China to develop a virtual monopoly on rare earth minerals crucial to the development of weapons for our defense? No. No, of course. One doesn't even have to look at this in retrospect. Why would you give another country, any other country, especially a hostile one, a communist country, a chokehold over your economy? Why would you do that? And again, it leads me to speculate just how many of the members of our elite, politicians, businessmen, academics, members of the media, have been suborned by the People's Republic of China. I don't think that it is an insignificant number. The globalists, they are feeling threatened. It's afraid. And we learned, yesterday? That popular opinion in Canada is strongly against higher immigration. But see, we're told that you're stupid if you think this, despite the fact that immigration is an enormous economic burden for ordinary Canadians. The immigrants benefit, but essentially immigration shifts money from the middle class to the upper class, to the 10%, especially the 1%. Andrew Coyne, who is strangely dubbed a conservative, he is nothing of the sort. He is a radical autonomist and a immigration champion. But he has blighted the opinion pages in my country for decades now, and he is very upset. Our way of life is fragile. Only trust can preserve it. Yes, people who make a fetish of the free market talking about trust. That is so funny. People who make transactional relations, they only import. What else can we make transactional? Modernity makes us rich, he writes in the Globe and Mail today. It also makes us vulnerable. Vulnerability is the inescapable condition of modern life, the price of our prosperity. Globalization, the knitting together of countries around the world through trade, travel, and communication, assisted by advances in the technologies of transmission, computation, and transportation, is only an aspect of modernity, one extending to movements of people, goods, and capital across national borders, the kind of freedom that had already long existed within each country. Oh, I see. So everyone in Hungary gets to move from one part of Hungary to another part of Hungary. So how is that different from allowing people, from the Congo and China and, Syria to move to Hungary? I mean, it's the same principle, right? This is actually how neoliberals think. We are increasingly aware, and never more so today, of how exposed this makes us to violent attack, to logistical bottlenecks, and to viruses, figurative and literal. The whole project of globalization looks suddenly fragile, overstretched, lacking resiliency because it is lacking in redundancy. Yeah, you're just figuring that out now, Andy. But the truth is that the same risks are present intranationally, as we have lately been reminded in this country. The whole project of modernity of the nation state that it was creation was to relieve individuals and communities of certain risks against which they had previously had to protect themselves. Cities are no longer ringed by walls that protect against marauding bands, nor are property owners obliged to cower behind stone fortifications surrounded by moats. We move about with ease and freedom from fear. Oh, yeah, that's why the insurance industry is so big. That's why burglar alarms, you get a certain level, your house is worth so much, well, you got to invest in the burglar alarms. And why people stopped going out in public? One of the reasons is that public places are unsafe. And if they're not unsafe, they are often deeply unpleasant because our elite has decided that, junkies and the like, we all love junkies and we would want to chase them away. And people urinating and defecating in public or exercising their constitutional rights or some such thing. So amazingly, Andrew Coyne writes, of all the ties that connect us, the most valuable and most fragile one is trust. That willingness indeed to let down our guard, to work with rather than against one another. The high degree of social trust in liberal societies, trust in the state to defend us, trust in others not to harm us, is their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. Trust, however long it may have taken to form, can disappear overnight. I'm sure that Andrew Coyne has heard of Robert Putnam. And for those who are unaware of him, Robert Putnam is a liberal. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone. He sat on his findings for years because they were so disturbing. Essentially, diversity, multiculturalism, it destroys trust and it destroys community. And it leads to a situation such as we face now. Oh, we have an emergency, a real emergency, and we're going to ask people to make sacrifices. Oh, we're going to ask people to make sacrifices because the elite tells us that we must do so. These various, Andrew Coyne is one of those people who, well, yes, we have to have immigration, and if high immigration from third world countries, and if the people don't like it, well, that's because they're stupid or they are uninformed. And this essay becomes increasingly, pathetic. Oh, yes, but there's a stirring peroration here. Democracies, it has been said, are slow to go to war, but almost unbeatable when they do. For democracies retain, to a greater or lesser degree, that vital element of trust other societies lack. Their citizens, once convinced of the necessity of war, fight with unmatched resolve. Is he going to slap on a tin helmet? Is he going to be directing this war in some way? When was the last time there was a war that a democracy fought which was particularly popular? Vietnam wasn't very popular for the reason that a great many people thought that America had been hoodwinked into that war, and it was hoodwinked into that war. And why are we fighting wars now that we're not trying to win in the way that everyone understands winning? talking about these limited objectives or 100-year war, or Max Boot with his 300-year war. Democracies rose to the challenge in past wars, enlisting voluntarily. Oh, not in Canada, they didn't. My country nearly came apart, both in the First World War and in the Second World War, because of conscription in Quebec. The Quebecois wanted nothing to do with what they saw as an imperialist war. Obeying blackouts, buying war bonds, the current war requires no less. Wow. Again, the trust is gone, and it's not coming back, not under the current regime. So a strange situation in Italy, all sorts of strange things going on there. The Diocese of Rome has issued a new decree partially reversing Thursday's decision to close all Catholic churches in the city, now ordering that parish and mission churches be reopened. This decision was not very popular. If the churches are closed, then, well, how are people going to get communion? There are 7 sacraments in the Catholic Church, and they are thought to be efficacious. But no, we're just going to close the churches because who needs the sacraments anyway? Reuters reported Catholics criticized the Cardinal's order to close churches in Rome on Friday to help contain the spread of coronavirus. Some took to social media to rail against the move by Cardinal Angelo Di Donatis, accusing him of caving into the government. One said the move had put Christ in quarantine. The Pope seems to have had second thoughts about this. And what does this suggest to us? This willingness, this eagerness to shut down all the churches. Well, the traditionalist site, Rorata Caeli, says we must be honest. Most of our bishops and not a small part of our priests do not believe in the supernatural life. They act according to what they believe, but God will hold them to account. So the Vatican announced with great fanfare a field hospital. That didn't last very long. At the first sign of real need, the field hospital of the church, promoted by Pope Francis, has suddenly vaporized, wrote one Italian Twitter user in response to the decision of Italy's bishops to close all churches, writes Edward Penton of the National Catholic Register. Again, from Rorata Caeli, it's very appropriate that we are celebrating the 7th anniversary of the election of Francis with all churches in Italy closed. And for those who have followed the Pope from the beginning, I guess this isn't really much of a surprise. There is an editorial in the India Post by A.Q. Siddiqui, "Coronavirus, is God unhappy with mankind?" On the book club a year ago, I talked about a dystopian prophetic novel by Anthony Burgess called The Wanting Seed. So the theme of this novel is that, which came out in, I believe, 1961, that our pursuit of barrenness, the decision to separate sexual intercourse from procreation, has shifted everything. And that in this novel, God punishes the world by killing all living things, vegetation, fish, etc., etc., so that the people will learn to repent the wickedness of their ways. According to this essay, St. Peter's Square at the Vatican City in Italy is deserted. The Pope Supreme Pontiff has canceled all meetings, engagements. The world is cut off from home. Bethlehem has been locked down too, even the Church of the Nativity. The sages among mankind believe that God will be unhappy when justice will be denied, when atrocities against mankind will increase, users will usurp their powers and suppress their subjects, courts will shun justice, judges will indulge in favoritism. Does this imply if God is unhappy, he is punishing mankind. The Holy Scriptures, from the Old Testament, Bible to Quran, a verses warning about the punishment of God. History tells us of the storm of Noah that drowned his earlier creation. And I'm reminded, of course, that the rainbow is the symbol that God gave to Noah, saying that the earth would never suffer a great flood, and that we decided that it was very amusing to make the rainbow the symbol of barrenness, the symbol of homosexuality and transsexualism and all of the alphabet people things. I can hardly think of a stronger provocation to God than what we have done with the rainbow. You know, if Christians believe in the efficacy of prayer, and they're supposed to, one would expect a great many calls for people to pray more often, for longer periods, and more deeply, with more passion. But, you know, the church has become transactional as well. So, oh yeah, let's check in on the on the chat. What's going on there? I think there would be many would-be antichrists, says Gerald Perry. Figures who could have been the Antichrist and the devil wanted to be, but God restrained him. A couple of decades ago, I joked that clearly the best candidate for the Antichrist was Bono of the group U2. But they're not so popular anymore, are they? How about Greta Thunberg? Octopus Knight says, don't forget the A, the so-called straight allies. They're alphabet people, too. I don't think that Pope Francis is the Antichrist, says Gerard Perry. I'm not going to utter an opinion on that. How about that? Polite Leader has a great video about Bono. What do they call him now? They called him for some time Mrs. Winterbottom. Because he resembles a middle-aged woman. The Wanting Seed is a fantastic novel, actually. That, again, this separation of sexual intercourse from procreation, oh, well, it's more convenient for us, and it makes sex, you know, fun without consequences, you know, except for various types of, you know, venereal diseases, which we can't get rid of anymore. Yeah, I was thinking, you know, people have said, and people continue to say, that the changes in sexual mores, the so-called sexual revolution, is permanent. Well, all it would take would be for, you know, some strain of venereal disease that could not be stopped and killed a great many people for the sexual revolution to come to an end in pretty short order. Okay, so you remember this very silly woman from the New York Times, and she got on Brian Williams' show, and she said some very stupid things about Bloomberg's campaign and what Bloomberg could have bought with his money. You remember that, right? And how she became a laughingstock instantly. Well, her name is Mara Gay, and she's a member of the editorial board of the New York Times. My people have been through worse than a Twitter mob. When you're a black woman in America with a public voice, a trivial math error can lead to a deluge of hate. No, it wasn't a trivial math error. It was a monumental error. That is the difficulty. And she doesn't seem to understand that it wasn't a trivial error. So, yeah. She said the math, as a few people have pointed out, was wrong. Overnight, I'd become an online sensation, and not in a good way. The video had gone viral, first shared by the right wing, and then by seemingly everyone else, too. Some people seem surprised I couldn't fact-check arithmetic on live TV. Yeah, like adding 3 zeros. That's really hard, isn't it? Let me assure you that my high school math teachers were not among those people. This is a woman who was on the staff of the Wall Street Journal, which is a newspaper primarily about finance. So if you have trouble adding 3 zeros to a number or adding 6 zeros to a number, what are you doing writing for the Wall Street Journal? And why are you boasting about this? Why are you boasting about your stupidity? Not that long ago, people who were, not good at math and were in a position where math might be expected. We're talking about simple math here, arithmetic. They keep stum about this. Right-wing trolls celebrated, and some journalists too. Oh my, where's the solidarity? Most of them were men, of course, who are prolific on Twitter. Going out and doing actual reporting, that's harder. The next time they make a mistake, I hope people are nicer to them than they were to me. Again, this woman lays down the law on a regular basis. You are doing this, you must stop doing that, it is bad. But no, people are being mean to her. My great sin was trivial, harmless, silly. What's it like when people are trying to cancel you for a math mistake? Well, I see that she's still on the editorial board of the New York Times. Now, curiously, the N-word appears in this story, and it is not called the N-word, and there are no dashes or asterisks, so apparently that word can be used, but only if you are a black person railing against the racism of white people. A colleague at the Times, an African-American woman, wrote to me on Friday afternoon, they resent that you exist. No, I don't resent that Mara Gay exists. Not a bit of it. I do resent that she's on the editorial board of the New York Times, and I do resent the fact that she is called on to MSNBC to lecture people about what's what. Oh my God, it was shared on Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. John Oliver, et tu, John? I began to wonder how others in the same position had managed to carry on. I tried to imagine what it must have been like for Monica Lewinsky. I think Monica Lewinsky had it a little harder than you did. But again, Monica Lewinsky is still carrying on about what happened in the 90s. She can't let it go. And it probably would have been a good idea, instead of writing this cri de coeur and bringing race into it, just, this is the internet age and people forget about these things quickly. But no, you just couldn't resist. You couldn't. I write a lot about the underdog, she says. Yes, and people are on the editorial board. The New York Times are generally considered to be, underdogs. And the New York Times, of course, is a great friend to the underdog. If you, define the underdog as neoliberalism. When I appeared on that TV program last week, I'd been working for many days interviewing black voters in the South who were determined to defeat Donald Trump, whom they see as the nightmare embodiment of the old hatreds many of them fought to overcome. Well, 1965 was, let me do some arithmetic in my head here, 35 plus 20, 55 years ago. How many of these people are still alive? Let's go back to the 60s. Let's go back to the glory years of the civil rights movement. Many of those Americans had survived far worse under the racial terror of Jim Crow than anything I can imagine. Then why are you comparing yourself to them? I thought about the black men I had met at the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, who had been beaten bloody by the police there half a century ago. I thought about the older black woman who approached me in a Selma coffee shop to tell me she was proud of me. Why? I thought of my father, who grew up enduring the daily indignities of segregated South Carolina and Detroit. I am here because of them, and there is nothing the haters can do about it. No, apparently not. But on the other hand, there is nothing that can stop Mara Gay from continually beclowning herself. I'm reminded, someone calling himself Black Seraphim sent me this information, which is very useful. Explains much of what we see from Mara Gay and her ilk. This is from a study, scientific study. Rather, we said that when those who are stigmatized explain negative outcomes as being due to discrimination rather than being due to internal, stable, and global causes, it can have the consequence of protecting self-esteem. self-esteem. We constantly hear about the low self-esteem of Black people in the United States. It's not true. The people with the highest self-esteem of all measured people in the United States are Black male adolescents who, reportedly live a life of daily horror. Now, to be honest, a great many of them do. Oh, yes, someone called Nilo Tabrizi, who I'd never heard of until yesterday. Let's see who she is. She's a video journalist with, wait for it, the New York Times. She's a Vice News and Al Jazeera English alum. She makes videos, eats pashmak, whatever that is. It's always got to bring the food in there. And anyway, she writes, being a woman journalist while trying to report on serious stories, coronavirus be like, message she got, Nilo, do you date white guys? Nilo, you're looking very beautiful. I love you. Accept my love, Nilo. They just can't stop humble bragging. It's just such an ordeal to be told how sexually desirable I am by people. Yeah, women hate that. They absolutely hate that. That's what we're supposed to believe in any event. Thandi Newton, 47, who was awarded an OBE for services to film and charity, says the word empire should be removed from honors because it is outdated. Why didn't she just return it? Her mother was born in Zimbabwe. Maybe, if it is so oppressive, living in a country which throws honors at you, but they have the word empire in it, maybe you could find somewhere else to work. A labor leadership hopeful Lisa Nandy said empire should be removed. It's outdated. Newton, who is known for roles in films including Crash, The Pursuit of Happiness, that's that Will Smith movie, and Solo, a Star Wars movie. You might want to keep silent about that last one. So here we have a privileged person who just can't stop whining, can't stop complaining. Ms. Nandy pointed to the example of the poet Benjamin Zephaniah, who turned down an OBE because it reminded him of thousands of years of brutality. Well, I suppose, if you see the Union Jack, but thousands of years? What? Thousands of years? How long does he think the British Empire was around for? 2,000 years ago, Britain, or England at the very least, was a colony of Rome. So I think I have one more in this. See, we don't want to follow the rules. The rules are for fools. Let's just change everything, like knowing basic arithmetic, or maybe, not accepting the honors of a country that you despise. Or how about real simpler rules than that? Ex-Miss World 24 slams equality's watchdog for dropping her bid to change the law after she was stripped of her title because she was divorced with a 4-year-old son. Veronika Didusenko was crowned Miss Ukraine in 2018 but was stripped of her title. She launched a legal action at Miss World claiming it breached the Equalities Act, but the commission said it does not think the matter will advance strategic priority aims. She hit out at the commission for not acting. Well, I have to say that unlike most so-called beauty queens these days, this woman, Didusenko, is a very attractive woman indeed. But, I mean, those are the rules. They have beauty contests for people who have been married and with children, but she entered one in which this was not permitted. But no, everything has to be turned upside down to accommodate you. There's a woman called Ulrika Johnson who is constantly in the news in Britain. Let's see, she is a UK-based Swedish television presenter and model. She presented the UK version of Gladiators. She has been married 3 times. She has 4 children, and Yes, she has suffered from a sex addiction, but now she is determined to embarrass her children. I wouldn't discourage my daughters from having one night stands, Ulrika Johnson reveals. How the first night with her new boyfriend revived her love of sex, ended a 5-year drought, and she doesn't care who knows it. There's a picture of her for this article. She has various tattoos on her right arm. One of them says feminist, and it's spelled out phonetically as if, in a dictionary. I don't know what the other one says. She's wearing lingerie and thigh-high stockings, and she is straddling a chair, Christine Keeler style. She's 52 years old, and she's carrying on like this in public. It's a grim reminder of what certain choices lead to. But of course, up to the choice that she made in order to embarrass her children in the pages of the Daily Mail. I suspect that's because intimacy has been missing from my life for so long, and now I have it back. I'm determined to cherish it. You can't have intimacy if every single thing you do is going to be broadcast to the world. That's the trade-off. Why would anyone confess any kind of secret of any kind to Ulrika Johnson with the expectation that this is going to be splashed in the Daily Mail? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, does it? Let's talk about Andrew Gillum. The book club's going to be a little late today because there's just so much to talk about. Andrew Gillum, he was going to win for Florida governor, just like Stacey Abrams was going to win in Georgia. Gillum was the mayor of Tallahassee, and Stacey Abrams was the Senate Minority Leader in Georgia, who for some reason is talked about as Joe Biden's Veep choice because of her, enormous accomplishments. In the election, Gillum, who was the mayor of Tallahassee, he lost by 33,000 votes, by 0.4%. Quite a bullet dodged there. We see that this fellow, what he first ran for, yes, he was first elected to public office at the age of 23. Now, I'm not saying that there should be any laws prohibiting anyone, say, from under the age of 30 from running for public office, but when someone runs at 23 or 20, and we have a 19-year-old, we have 19-year-old MPs in Canada. They're power mad. They're absolutely power mad, and all politicians are narcissists. But of course, if you really think that you're 23 years old and you should be deciding, how people do things, then your narcissism is dangerous. Gillum was involved with a number of scandals in his political life, which he managed to squirm out of in various ways, accepting gifts, tickets, and the like, conflicts of interest of various kinds. I note that he is married and he has 3 children, but it would seem that he was living a lie. Andrew Gillum found in Miami Beach hotel room with suspected drugs, police say. He was not arrested, was too intoxicated to answer questions. He was found in this room in the company of a man who appeared to have overdosed on drugs. Police were called to the Mondrian South Beach early Friday morning and found paramedics treating Travis Dyson, a 30-year-old Miami man for apparent heart attack. They say 2 other men were in the room, Aldo Mejias and Gillum. An offense incident report said that officers found 3 clear plastic bags of suspected crystal meth on the bed and floor. He issued a statement this afternoon. I was in Miami last night for a wedding celebration when first responders were called to assist one of my friends. Well, I had too much to drink. I want to be clear that I have never used methamphetamines. I apologize to the people of Florida for the distraction. This has caused our movement. According to police, Macias told officers that he gave his credit card information to Dyson to rent the room and planned to meet him Friday evening. When he went to the room after 11 p.m., Macias said he found Dyson and Gillum under the influence of an unknown substance. Macias, 56, said Dyson opened the door to room 1107 to let him in and then collapsed on the bed. He said Dyson was having trouble breathing, so he woke him up. Dyson then vomited and collapsed again, so Macias said he performed chest compressions on Dyson and called paramedics. He told the police he saw Gillum, 40, vomit in the bathroom. At this time, the incident is not being investigated as a criminal matter, a Miami Beach police spokesman said without explaining why. Oh, yeah. Okay, so what else do we know about this? There's a funny tweet here from David Christensen. Andrew Gillum, photo left, was found vomiting in the bathroom, severely inebriated in a hotel room with 2 other men and 3 bags of crystal meth. One of the men, Travis Dyson, photo, viewers right, a known gay male escort, was rushed to the hospital for a possible overdose. And there's a picture from the beach with these very muscular black men who are pulling their swimming suits off to expose their buttocks. Perhaps this is part of the sales brochure. It just seems to me that black culture in the United States is becoming homosexual at a very fast rate. Cory Booker, is he still maintaining this fiction that Rosario Dawson is his girlfriend? I mean, he's not in the race anymore. Oh, I mean, I could list names, but it seems if you look at the people involved in the culture, actors, actresses, people involved in the music business, as far as I can tell, I mean, half of them or more appear to be homosexual. But we're told that black culture is very much disapproving of homosexuality. I'm kind of curious, a man who goes to a hotel room with gay escort in a room where there is methamphetamine, and, when you're well known, as Gillum is, this is exceedingly reckless behavior. So are we supposed to believe that at the age of 40, that this is the first time that Gillum has ever engaged in such reckless behavior? Or is it more likely that Gillum's predilections were known and covered up because he was an up-and-coming politician? I think the latter is more likely. Bruce Charlton, Dr. Bruce Charlton is a fascinating fellow, at least to me. He has quite a disturbing piece on his website about COVID-19, the spring 2020 totalitarian power grab that I've been expecting, but in an example of demonic improvisation justified by an invisible virus with a routine tiny global impact covered by media censorship and selective overreporting instead of the planned invisible carbon dioxide, global warming, climate emergency, extinction rebellion, terror crisis. On the whole, it is scarier to believe in a world plague than creeping sea levels. And so long as every international death is reported with race, age, and health details censored, it does indeed sound scary, even when the percentage affected is sub-detectable by normal standards. The newspaper headlines today have described that the UK government has implemented a state of war and control of public gatherings. Despite that, in global terms, nothing has happened. But nothing is, in fact, more than enough to create genuine chaos, a genuine emergency requiring sweeping powers. So we have it. It has happened, and with support from a terrified mass public. My next prediction is that the demonic roots will quickly become evident to those with eyes to see in terms of what actually happens. As a small but insignificant instance, keep a particular eye on what happens to government regulation of Christian church gatherings compared with other kinds of monotheistic church gatherings. We can indeed see in practice that free-floating fear is a sin, the opposite of God, and in a godless world, fear is readily created, amplified, manipulated, and directed without limit or feedback. Let's see, one of the commenters says, hysteria in the US. 6 people have died over several days, mostly elderly in a nursing home. Note that about 6 people a day are dying in Chicago due to criminal violence. No emergency in Chicago over that. LOL. And again, it is, maybe they'll be stacking the dead like cordwood soon enough. And it is better to be safe rather than sorry. But we weren't very long into this when, no, we're going to have to, close the churches. And of course, the Catholic Church greeted that with alacrity. I think the leadership of the Catholic Church, the hierarchy, would probably be happier overall if they didn't have to worry about the bother of churches, where they could just, send out press releases, condemning racism and xenophobia and doubtless transphobia. So, yes, in that regard, The Remnant is a Catholic newspaper which I highly recommend. And they make videos, amusing videos, but apparently they're being cracked down upon by YouTube. Michael Matt, who's the editor of The Remnant, reports that in 2018, the Daily Caller broke the story that the SPLC is assisting YouTube in policing content on its platform. No surprise then that The Remnant has already been demonetized and shadow banned, and now this. YouTube slapped an age restriction on Remnant TV's most recent Sunday sermon, Chinese Catholics Betray, Diocesan Priest Stands with Vigano and Cardinal Zen. Why would a sermon, which includes a trending topic, China and the coronavirus, and covers Archbishop Vigano's latest letter, be deemed unsuitable for those under 18? Father gave this sermon to a large congregation of all ages, by the way, unless YouTube is trying to tighten the noose around the neck of yet another conservative channel. What is YouTube so afraid of? The Chinese communists, as the sermon points out, are forcing abortions, arresting bishops and priests, terrorizing their own citizens. It's all documented photographic evidence that's easy to find. So does YouTube not want us defending Chinese Catholics persecuted by an intolerant and bigoted regime? Remnant TV is growing closer every day to being kicked off Google's massive streaming provider. However, we believe the Catholic cause is worth fighting for, and that video is a necessary medium to help spread the message. First off, I'm contesting this ridiculous age restriction flag with the YouTube team right now. Why? Because this is beyond stupid. In addition, we long ago anticipated the YouTube crackdown by building our own video hosting platform right here at Remnant Newspaper. We're revamping it right now by setting it up on remote servers around the country and in Europe to ensure quality playback. Now, there's a great deal made during the Cold War of Soviet repression of religion. Well, there is repression of religion in China, obviously. Christians are persecuted, and Falun Gong, which is a spiritual, if not a religious belief, is certainly persecuted. But we don't want to offend the Chinese for some reason. And of course, Pope Francis has decided to throw in his lot with the enemies of the Catholic faith in China, betraying millions of brave people. I suppose he has his reasons for that. But Dr. Charlton is right. The crisis that we're going through now gives the elite the opportunity perhaps to save their skins. Oh, this is an extraordinary situation. Force majeure is required. So yeah, we're going to slap down this, that, and the other, because we can't have people spreading fear and misinformation unless it is us spreading fear and misinformation. So the book club. Our book this week is by Christopher Caldwell, and it's called The Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s. It came out this year. And a lot of people were writing about it. And I guess it was timely because, as this live stream, this particular one this Friday demonstrates, there is a crisis of confidence in our elite, in our globalist, neoliberal, multicultural betters. Christopher Caldwell used to work for the Weekly Standard. I first came across him, I guess, quite a few years ago when he worked for the American Spectator, which was a long time ago, a very interesting and amusing magazine. Caldwell is a graduate of Harvard. And I see that he is married to Robert Novak's daughter. I quite liked Robert Novak. He has 5 children, and that I'm glad to see that. However, I see that one of his daughters is the campaign manager for Joe Walsh's presidential campaign against Donald Trump in 2020. What is the definition of quixotic? I think that would be. Caldwell, the thesis of this book is that America, it has an official constitution and an unofficial constitution. And the unofficial, that is to say, real Constitution of the United States are the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s. Now, after the Civil War, slavery was overturned. People were supposed to be equal, equality before the law, that sort of thing. But freedom depends on freedom of association. If you force people engaged in private enterprise or any kind of private activity to entertain or do business with others, then it's ridiculous to speak of freedom. He begins his book, Caldwell does, with the assassination of Kennedy. I have long thought that you could say that the 60s began with the assassination of Kennedy in November 22nd, 1963, for the reason that, what did we have before then? Well, if you watch the show Mad Men, you get a pretty good idea. Men were still wearing hats, for instance. And, the 50s, the organization man, that way of life, that continued up to 1963. Something seemed to have cracked in the American character with the assassination of Kennedy. It wasn't just the absurd conspiracy theories about who was responsible for his death. We know who was responsible for his death, a man called Lee Harvey Oswald, who was an ex-Marine who had defected to the Soviet Union, who hated the Kennedy government because of its attempts to remove the Castro government. But no, it's got to be the mafia, or it's got to be LBJ, or it's got to be the Castro government. But no, it's got to be the mafia, or it's got to be LBJ, or it's got to be the homosexual with alopecia. That was in Oliver Stone's movie, JFK. But stranger than the conspiracy theories was this seemingly manufactured wave of hysteria when Kennedy was killed. Kennedy became president in January 1961, so he had been president for less than 3 years when he was murdered. His presidency was not a successful one. He nearly got the world immolated in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was constantly blundering in his relations with the Soviet Union. His attempt to shepherd civil rights legislation through the Congress of the United States was a failure. It was only as a sort of posthumous gift to Kennedy and the cult that was created that LBJ was able to get civil rights legislation passed. Now, he talks about Kennedy's death giving tremendous impetus to changes already underway. And this is absolutely true. He says that a welfare state expanded by Medicare and Medicaid, the vast mobilization of young men to fight the Vietnam War, but above all, the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts These were all memorials to a slain ruler, resolved in haste over a few months in 1964 and 65 by people undergoing a delirium of national grief. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, was able to take ideas for civil rights legislation languishing in the months before Kennedy's death and cast them in a form more uncompromising than Kennedy would have imagined. Civil rights ideology, especially when it hardened into a body of legislation, became most unexpectedly the model for an entire new system of constantly churning political reform. Definitions of what was required in the name of justice and humanity broadened. Racial integration turned to the all-embracing ideology of diversity. Women's liberation moved on to a reconsideration of what it meant to be a woman and eventually a man. Immigration became grounds for reconsidering whether an American owed his primary allegiance to his country or whether other forms of belonging were more important. Anti-communist military adventures gave way once communism began to collapse to a role for the United States as the keeper of the whole world's peace, the guarantor of the whole world's prosperity, and the promulgator and, hang on just one second here, an enforcer of ethical codes for a new international order, which was sometimes called the global economy. What Caldwell is describing here is a permanent revolution. And I have to say here, the conservative movement has never understood, the flow of history. There is never stasis. Things are always moving in one direction or another. And throughout the permanent revolution, which began in the 1960s, the so-called conservatives have said, no, 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 okay, yes, but this is the last demand we're giving into. After all, these people have everything they want now, so there's not going to be more of this. But it never stops. It never stops. If you look at the condition, say, of homosexuals in the 1960s, in Britain, Canada, United States, homosexual activity was illegal. Now, it took longer in the United States than it did in Canada and Britain for homosexuality to be legalized. But roughly, let's say, 15 years ago, or with gay marriage in the United States, when Obama was president, all restrictions on homosexual behavior or any of the rights, benefits, perquisites that homosexuals didn't get where others did, this was all swept away. So you would think that let's say the homosexual civil rights movement would disappear. No, 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 no. It's stronger than ever. That what are the next steps? Well, there are going to be next steps that are going to be demanded. When I was talking about Peachy Keenan's piece in the American Mind about parents acting as procurers for their children, there's no question in my mind that in sex ed classes and perhaps across the curriculum, that students are going to be told that, oh, you say you don't want a black boyfriend, say. Well, have you ever had a black boyfriend? You haven't. Well, this is mindless prejudice. You see, you could only say that you wouldn't want that if you had tried it and not liked it. Similarly, boys will be told, oh, you don't want to have sexual relations with another boy. Again, this is mindless prejudice. How would you know? Girls will be told the same about other girls. Trust me, it's coming. If it hasn't already started. Now, there's been a fundamental change in what we understand the role of government to be. That, oh, there must be some great project. The role of government was really quite modest. Even after Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, it was really quite modest until the 1960s, when a principle was established that not a leaf falls from a tree or a sparrow falls from a tree without the federal government in some way taking note of this and regulating it, or seeking to regulate it, or to state that too many of a certain kind of sparrows are falling from trees, and not all sparrows prosper equally, that there is disparate impact among different kinds of sparrows. And of course, the government must do something about that, because what is the role of government? It's not supposed to be a watchman, certainly. It is supposed to be pushing us, or dragging us, if you will, towards perfection, towards utopia. Now, he talks about Frederick Douglass, and how Frederick Douglass was an almost unknown figure when a new edition of his autobiography came out in 1960. It's highly worth reading, by the way. I often think that Martin Luther King Jr. was a bad man, just straight up a bad man. If there needed to be a public holiday, how about Frederick Douglass and George Washington Carver? They were good. Booker T. Washington. They were good men. Why not have a holiday for those two? Caldwell says civil rights transformed the country not just constitutionally, but also culturally and demographically in ways few people anticipated. It proved to be the mightiest instrument of domestic enforcement the country had ever seen. It can fairly be described as the largest undertaking of any kind in American history, costing trillions upon trillions of dollars and spanning half a century. It rivals, in terms of energy invested, the peopling of the West, the building of the transcontinental railways and highways, the maintenance of a Pax Americana for half a century after World War II, or for that matter, any of the wars the country has fought, foreign or civil. Yes, he talks about what William James called the moral equivalent of war, or when people were attacking Jimmy Carter, they called it meow, which I thought was very amusing. Caldwell says the reinterpretation of America's entire history and purpose in light of its race problem is the main ideological legacy of the last 50 years. And of course, we're nowhere near the end if current trends continue. That I guess the state of Washington will have to be renamed, that Washington District of Columbia will have to be renamed. Monuments to Washington and Jefferson will have to be pulled down because they owned slaves. And the racial question is, I guess, the only important question in the new America. And that the America of the founding, the America of 1789, was a failure because of race. Now, how one can expect to offer one's allegiance to a country that was founded in evil is a question that our elite doesn't seem to be interested in thinking about. Caldwell writes, the U.S. of today is a free country in a very different sense than it was between the administrations of George Washington and JFK. And he talks about Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. The unanimous Supreme Court decision that ordered the desegregation of all the country schools. It was not just a landmark decision, but an unusual one. It was brief to the point of curtness. Shorn of footnotes and case references, each of its two parts ran about the length of a newspaper column. It was less of a judicial argument than a judicial order. The justices ignored the subject to which they had devoted most of their deliberations, whether the 14th Amendment, drafted in the wake of the Civil War to guarantee equal protection of the laws that intended to permit segregated schools. Instead, they asked whether the doctrine of separate but equal, used to justify school segregation, was possible in practice. And how do they do that? Sociology. Yeah, that's what they used. So, we're not interested in what the law has to say. We're interested in the results. And that's how we end up with disparate impact. Now, he looks into the question of what did whites think they were getting with this revolution, and says the mood of the public is hard to gauge. Certainly many white people did wish for the civil rights revolution in the last summer of JFK's life, but plurality, 49 to 42%, said they favored a law that would give all persons, Negro as well as white, the right to be served in public places such as hotels, restaurants, theaters, and similar establishments. But of course, I suppose that the main difficulty with the Civil Rights Revolution is the belief at the time, which was held across the board, not by all people, but by, I would say, most people of goodwill, that the privileges accorded to minorities, well, first to black minorities and then to every other conceivable kind of minority, were a temporary measure. That blacks had been held back. We have an opportunity now to help them out for a short period of time, and then, with this special help and with the prejudices removed against them, well, the privileges won't be necessary because a state of equality will have been reached, but that equality did not come about. And as a result, the black leadership of the United States seems to be angrier now than it was. Well, you'd have to go back, say, to Huey Newton and the Black Panthers, say, but that was a small group. The black leadership in the United States now, it seems to become angrier with every passing day that big changes are needed. Well, there have been big changes since the 1960s, but apparently it's not enough. Caldwell says, as a practical matter, whites did not suspect that they would see the vast increase in federal government oversight that would become the sine qua non of civil rights. The congressional debate leading up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is filled with outright mockery of those who warned of some hitherto unimaginable federal government infringement, not just the regulation of Mrs. Murphy's rooming house mentioned above, but also mandatory school busing, public and private hiring quarters, and immigration quotas. In the spring of 1964, when Florida Democratic Senator George Smathers worried that attempts to equalize school enrollment might lead to busing, his Pennsylvania Republican colleague Hugh Scott scoffed. Does the senator not agree that there is nothing whatever in the bill which relates to the transportation of school children by bus from one district to another? The courts found differently and took over many cities' school systems. Boston, Kansas City are two of the most notorious. And of course, with regard to school busing, it's difficult to understand this in any other terms but vengeance. Simple vengeance that the proles have to pay for what exactly? For what? For slavery? The proles weren't beneficiaries of slavery. But what all this led to, according to Caldwell, I guess is a conversation, a never-ending conversation about who we are as Americans. Now, the ambiguity there is terrifying, but it's a one-way conversation. We heard a few years ago about, I think it was Eric Holder said that America needed to have a national conversation on race. Well, what that means is that I and people like me are going to lecture you on your shortcomings, and we're going to give you a list of what is required to deal with them. Caldwell writes, what Americans had to show at the end of a half century was a version of what they had at the beginning, a mix of energy and conformism, pride and disappointment. These things were hard to disentangle. Americans were certainly content with the achievements of civil rights. What it promised and delivered, a rough kind of racial equality in the states that lacked it, was an extraordinary achievement. There were unexpected collateral blessings, too, beyond a freer life for many blacks, the lifting of a burden of guilt from certain whites, scope for working women, a less anguished life for gays. What the reforms aspired and failed to do, produce harmony between the races and peace between the sexes, may have been beyond the power of any government reform to achieve. Well, one result of the civil rights legislation in the 1960s was that when black people learned that they did not have to live among their own people in the projects or the ghetto or the inner city, as it's called now, a large number of them, roughly about half, cleared out. And the people who cleared out were those people who set the standards, the social standards for those communities, such that the standards collapsed. with the result that close to half of Black Americans live in conditions so dire, so anarchic, that it's been decided it's best that we look away and not talk about this. Instead, let's talk about gun violence as if it is not people pulling the trigger. It's just some sort of strange cosmic force. The people who live in the inner city now, well, they're forgotten. They're forgotten. They're not the people who are going to get the affirmative action jobs, public or private. They are one of the unintended consequences of the civil rights revolution. According to a 2011 Pew Research Center survey, 23% of those born in the baby boom generation before believed America's new diversity was a change for the better. 42% called it a change for the worse. Caldwell describes in the book how, on the one hand, America is obsessed by the subject of race, but on the other hand, there's no honest conversation that is permitted about it. Even to acknowledge that it exists, or that there might be a difference of opinion between people based on their race, that is a controversial notion. The baby boomers, the baby boomers think things have got worse, but that's because they're old and stupid, apparently. When we deal with younger generations, these generations have been raised in conditions where, again, there are certain things that aren't discussed, and also they have no memory of previous times. They have no memory, for instance, of not being afraid of every single thing that they say. Every single thing that they say could possibly be held to be offensive, if not today, and then tomorrow. He talks about America being a creedal nation, a country united not by race or by history, but belief in certain ideas. This sounds like open-mindedness, but if not managed carefully, it can turn into the opposite. A country you can join by simply changing your mind is a country you can fall out of by doing the same. On literally dozens of occasions, as President Barack Obama described highly specific political opinions, always known of his own party, as expressing who we are to Americans. Not since the McCarthy era had Americans been told that to disagree with the authorities was to forfeit one's membership. Now, I think this is unfair to the late Senator McCarthy, because McCarthy was never a member of the elite. He was certainly on the outs with his own Republican Party. Harry Truman's government, he was Tail Gunner Joe. He was a prole. So he was a figure of fun from the beginning. So we end up in a situation where it is obvious that there has been an enormous change, and that change is not going to end, and that people are anxious about what the final results are going to be. He concludes, Ronald Reagan, for all the prosperity Americans enjoyed under his presidency, never found anything like the resources to carry out the projects Lyndon Johnson devised in the 60s. He merely averted the social confrontation to which events had been building in the 1970s by devising a new system for financing those projects. That's what today's national debt is. The financial collapse of 2008 was a sign that the government had exhausted the resources of the not yet born and would now need to tap the resources of the living. Whether it could manage this was impossible to say. Meanwhile, the country's economic and political leaders were more isolated from ordinary citizens than they had been for more than a century. The American people were a closed book to them. In June 2015, with the presidential election heating up, the talk show host Bill Maher invited a handful of journalists to discuss the future of American politics. A dozen Republicans well respected within the party were seeking the nomination. Maher asked one of his guests, the conservative journalist Ann Coulter, which candidate had the best chance of winning the general election. Her reply was surprising. She didn't think any of them would get the nomination. A self-promoting New York real estate developer, however, had announced his candidacy 3 days before. Appearing in a Manhattan office building he pretended to own, making a few off-the-cuff sounding remarks about Mexican immigration and how great America could be, and eliciting the unanimous ridicule of the press corps. Coulter stonily spoke his name. Her fellow panelists seemed to think she was cracking a joke. They twisted their faces into histrionic expressions of puzzlement to play along. The studio audience roared with laughter. Well, you know, as I quoted Bob Dylan at the top of the show, there's something happening here, but you don't know what it is, Mr. Jones. And Caldwell's book is very useful to the general reader, and I suspect it would be particularly useful to members of the elite if they are interested in the question of why they are so hated. But you know, I read from Andrew Coyne's lengthy cri de coeur, and they're not interested to know why they are hated. They are, this is all a big mystery. They are hurt, but they are also angry. We are your betters. We know things that you don't. We are interested in the big picture. You are interested in petty parochial concerns, you know, for instance, whether you're going to have enough money to make your mortgage payment, or are your children are they ever going to be able to get decent jobs? Are they going to be buried by debt from going to college, which has become mandatory? There was a lot of anger directed at Caldwell's book, you know, which is a good sign. If a book is universally acclaimed, that tells us that there's not much of substance there. There's a lot of substance in Caldwell's book. I suspect that you know, most of the themes and many of the things that he talks about will be familiar to listeners of this live stream. But I suppose perhaps the most valuable point of the book is to use as a cudgel against the constitutionalists. You know, my Constitution. Well, the Supreme Court decides what the Constitution means. The Supreme Court has decided that it certainly doesn't mean equality, and it certainly doesn't mean freedom of association. You know, the Soviet Union came up with a pretty good constitution in 1936, but it all depends upon how it's interpreted and who is interpreting it. I think that there are fewer of these constitutionalists than there were certainly in 2015 or 2016, but I really think that the so-called constitutionalists in America, and we have a similar difficulty in Canada with people carrying on about our Charter and rights and freedoms as if it guarantees us any rights or freedoms, which it doesn't. But these people need to decide whether their loyalty is to a document or to their country and their people. I'm going to have one last look at the chat here. Okay, let me keep scrolling down. Okay. All right. Jonathan Paul says Trotsky's permanent revolution died in the suppression of the 1927 Shanghai uprising. I'm going to be talking about Kotkin's volume 2 of his biography of Stalin, and again, just the parallels to the present age, where they actually had this term "former people," you know, referring to kulaks and you know, the sons of czarist officials or the sons of children of priests and the like. And oh yeah, Russian bots. Well, in the Soviet Union, you had the so-called right deviationists and the left deviationists, and oh, they're all in it together. They have put aside their differences because they don't really have any differences, and they are a united front working everywhere to cripple the Soviet Union. Everything that goes bad is not due to incompetence or shoddy materials or lack of training. It is due to sabotage. And it never stops. The traitors are everywhere, and the vigilance must be unrelenting. And also, a great many of the people that we think are on our side are actually on the other side. There are traitors everywhere. And it's like reading about what is in the news today, reading about Stalinism in the 1930s. It just, total control over the news, the dissemination of information, whipping people into a state of hysteria, telling people not to believe the evidence of their eyes and ears. So I am going to wrap up the show for this week. I would like to thank everyone for listening, for watching. I would encourage people, if they like the show, to press the like button and to subscribe to my YouTube channel. As mentioned earlier, if you would like to donate to the program, my PayPal account is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. I hope that you all have a great weekend, and that none of you get infected, and that, God forbid that you do, that you live to tell the tale. Good night.